Good afternoon. Thank you for coming to University of Texas El Paso today to be present for our Homeland Security Symposium Series with Dr. Chuck Katz. As you know, the topic is the structure, behavior, and influence of El Salvadorian gangs and the implication for the rule of law in the United States and El Salvador. This is actually the 5th of 9 symposiums that we put on. We have 4 more to go. The next one's December 1st, a full day, and that is on adversarial reasoning and game theory. And we're looking at for February and so on. The beauty of this symposium series, it's funded by the Department of Homeland Security, Science and Technology Office of University Programs, through the actually through the University of Houston, through their Border Trades Institute. And so they allow me to actually put these symposiums on to no cost to you, and they're directed are aimed at practitioners at different levels. And in this room, you'll see that it's represented by 14 different agencies, federal, state, and local. That allows me to do that. The grant allows me to actually pay for certain other things, bring presenters, pay their air travel, lodging, things of that nature, so we can do this. And you see the cameras back here, and the reason for that, it's being webcast. And then we archive that information, so if you ever go to our website, and you'll see the website information in the registration packet, there may be something of an interest. For example, the first one we had was on interview and interrogation. Some research that was done on that might be an interest. You could actually find all the symposium items there. You can find everything from the PowerPoints to the agenda to the video, and actually the researchers' contact information to actually contact them directly if you choose to learn more about the information on that. So that's who funds this symposium. Like I said, it's about every 2 months, and we have 4 more after this. Okay, what I'd like to do before we actually start off the symposium is introduce you to Dr. Charles Katz. Charles Katz is the Watts Family Director for the Center for Violence Prevention and Community Safety, and he's a professor in the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Arizona State University. From his bio that in the packet, you can see that he's pretty well established in this topic and other topics that are, I think, very relevant to your day-to-day job on that. I think you'll find this topic very relevant, very insightful, and very interesting. One of the things I would ask you to do, though, is please don't think of this as a lecture where you're sitting down and you have an instructor that's speaking to you on that. Get something out of this by making it interactive. If you have questions, ask the questions on that. If you have a different perspective on that, please let Dr. Katz know on that. But the real value we've seen from previous symposiums has been the interaction from participants and the presenters on that. And you'll find that Dr. Katz is looking forward towards that kind of interaction and engagement. And with that, Dr. Katz.
Thanks for having me, Vic, and rest of the faculty here at UTEP. Wanted to thank everybody for showing up. I know everybody has lots of things to do. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah? Okay. One of the things I wanted to start with is sometimes when you have an outsider coming in, you're always wondering sort of what's going on. But one of the things that I wanted to reinforce to many of you here is that at UTEP, you really do have one of the strongest, what I call policing shops in the country in terms of higher education. You have a number of faculty here that do a lot of really good, applicable work to what you're all doing on an everyday basis. In the field, they're working alongside folks like you. And sometimes people don't realize it, but a number of the faculty here are ex-law enforcement. They ended up going on for their PhD. They understand things from a unique perspective that other folks don't. And so I guess part of this was I wanted to make sure everybody knows that there's a lot of opportunities in working with UTEP. They have a fantastic master's program, online program, and their faculty are some of the best in the country in terms of issues related to policing. And I feel very grateful that they invited me in here today to speak. And so what I wanted to do was talk to you a little bit about gangs, the transnational link between MS-13 in particular, between El Salvador and the United States, in particular LA, and the Washington, D.C. corridor. I'm going to go backwards a little bit and give you a little bit of background so that you might understand a little bit better about the perspective that I'm coming from. Most of the work that I do is run through a research center called the Center for Violence Prevention and Community Safety. And most of our work is collaborating with law enforcement agencies to increase their capacity to respond to problems, right? And so we will work with, for instance, right now we're in Compton, California, looking at issues with the Sheriff's Department on gangs. We're working in Honduras, dealing with issues related to gangs. We're running a technical assistance project in the implementation of body cameras, but our work is all done through agencies. It's not us in an ivory tower thinking about what's interesting to us, but rather what we're interested in is finding out what you are interested in and how we might be able to inform your decision making a little bit better than perhaps you did before. And so we have a little bit of freedom compared to some places. We have an endowment that allows us to keep some stable staff, bring in people who are experts in the field to help us guide us along. And it's allowed us to move along for about 10 years. But it's really allowed us to do things that perhaps other folks would have an opportunity to do because of lack of funding. And that is being embedded within law enforcement agencies to learn a little bit more about what they do. And to give you an idea of what we're up to now, we've been doing a lot of work with the Arnold Foundation with body cameras. I'm not sure if you're familiar with them. They're a family out of Texas that developed a fund in which they wanted to assist law enforcement through research and understanding a number of issues facing the police today. So they're funding us on understanding body-worn cameras in a number of cities. We are working, if you've heard, on deterred or focused deterrence or call-ins. We're working with the Phoenix Police Department where we take their gang intelligence along with violence data, engage in some fairly sophisticated analytical techniques to identify the 30 offenders that we think are most central to particular groups and identify them for call-ins for the mayor and district attorney and the chief of police and others to talk to. We're currently working with the Bureau of Justice Assistance on a project in rolling out the 50,000 body-worn cameras that the Obama administration swore that they were going to put out in light of Ferguson and some of those issues. So we're working with BJA to provide technical assistance to agencies that are implementing or choose to implement body cameras. And we run a research center alongside RAND, excuse me, that provides research assistance, technical assistance to small, rural, tribal, and border agencies, whether it's police, courts, corrections, and we basically try to identify what's of interest to them. We go out and conduct research and provide that information back to them, or if they need technical assistance in implementing a particular program, typically around issues of technology, we assist with those matters. And my point in bringing that up is this project in and of itself is really a reflection of what we do. It wasn't me saying, oh, I think MS-13 is interesting. I actually was not the individual who came up with the original idea of this. It was actually folks at DHS that approached us and were interested in it from a particular perspective. We are pretty firmly rooted in Central America. ASU now has an office in El Salvador where we've been doing a lot of work. We have a number of USAID funded projects down there. But what started some of this stuff was the Department of Homeland Security. And it started with this idea of a link between Al-Qaeda and MS-13. Right? In roughly 2005, 2006, you had this platform in which politicians were running off of, articulating that gangs were out of control, that there was a lack of government capacity to respond to MS-13 and other gangs, and they were concerned that a terrorist group would be able to move somebody from another location, move them to a place like El Salvador, Honduras, or Guatemala, and then be able to move them from Central America through Mexico into the United States. And the intelligence community here, law enforcement here, became concerned that that was a particular weakness, but they didn't know how big of a weakness it was. Many of you may have heard that MS-13 has been referred to as the most dangerous gang in America, the most organized gang, the most violent gang. And for those reasons, they're sort of coming together in terms of how organized they are, as well as how violent they are. People thought that they may be a classic example of a real threat to the United States. And they wanted to understand a little bit more about MS-13 and how they would, if they could, move folks from El Salvador to Mexico to the United States. And so they set us up really with a couple of problem statements. Like I said before, we don't come up with these questions ourselves. We help them and facilitate it. But the questions were, with this increased flow of undocumented immigrants, were problem individuals coming through, right? Did we have individuals that were associated with criminal organizations coming along with them? We see similar issues with that with Syria and refugees, right? And moving through. People were worried about, and this has been talked about now for a couple of decades, about this revolving door issue where people migrate to the United States, whether it's illegal or legally. They get deported back down to wherever they came from, and it's this revolving door of moving back and forth, which may have in fact then increased networks or criminal networks between the two nations due to the more consistent contact, right? There was this perception that there was increased social connectedness between these criminal organizations in El Salvador, Central America, and places like LA and the DC corridor. And so they thought this really was a plausible method in which problems could approach the United States, in which people could enter the United States illegal or legally with the help of a criminal organization. And we wanted to look at that. The issue really blew up when an individual running for president in Honduras said that there was an actual meeting between Al-Qaeda and MS-13. I've never been able to find real documented evidence that that actually occurred, but it helped spread the concern on that issue, and that's really what boiled down to why we were focusing on this project with DHS. And so, as part of the project, we typically try to go to who has the most at stake with this issue, who's the most interested in it, who do we think can use the information to their benefit. And my particular background and interest is in working with gang intelligence and gangs. So for me, a particularly good fit for this project was working with the ICE National Gang Unit. They were extremely helpful in this project. If it wasn't for their help, it really would have been a tough project to engage in. They provide us with a lot of direction, what they thought was what they needed to know. They provided us with important contacts, not only in the United States, but in El Salvador. And like I said, the project just couldn't have been done without them. And so what they were interested in is, one is, what is the scope of the problem, right? For those of you that are with DHS ICE, you know that there have been a number of fairly large operations focusing on MS-13 across the United States. Special attention in lately in the Washington, D.C. corridor. And they wanted to know both the informal and formal organization of the gang. And they wanted to know just how deeply embedded are folks who are in El Salvador, how embedded is that criminal network within criminal networks within the United States? And how organized is it? Is it really informal? Is it really organized? People weren't quite sure how organized MS-13 is. There has been really very little research done on MS-13 with the exception of work through law enforcement officials. So, for instance, some of you may have worked with MS-13, whether it's an informant, an arrestee, a victim. It could be a million things, but typically you interview them, You identify the information, and then you share that information with researchers or people in the intelligence field. A few researchers have tried to work in the area down in El Salvador on MS-13. A number of filmmakers have. I don't know how many of you followed it, but about 3 years ago, there were a couple of filmmakers who were killed by MS-13 as a consequence of attempting to make a documentary. Researchers have had a number of problems down there, and people haven't been able to successfully pull off much research. And so people wanted to know what's real. How much of this is myth? Really, how structured and powerful is MS-13 versus, right, what is reality and what's a myth? What's just not, we don't want to be responding to something that isn't real, right? And so we wanted to get into and speak to the people who were really involved with the gang. So a central premise of our project was interacting with MS-13 down in El Salvador through a couple of clique leaders who then introduced us to about 100 gang members. But I'll get to that in a second. And then we wanted to understand their methods. And particularly what we wanted to know is how different is it for a gang member to get to the United States, if they're a member of MS-13 or even 18th Street, versus somebody else who's not affiliated with a criminal organization. In theory, right, we would think that people who are involved with a group like MS-13 may have different types of ties that would allow them to get to the United States more efficiently, more effectively. It would cost them less, it would take less time, there would be less of a chance of being caught if their organizational structure was as tight as some folks articulated that it was. And so we wanted to look at comparing gang to non-gang members. And their entrance into the United States. And so we looked at those issues. So we had 3 sites. It was DC, Los Angeles, LA. I just noticed another misspelling. You are going to find, I was raised on phonetics, right, or phonics. I can't spell in any way, so I'm sure you're going to find some errors in here. But we had 6 major sources of data. We interviewed gang experts, people like yourselves, that were actively working with MS or 18th Street, gangs down in El Salvador. We did surveys of experts down in El Salvador within each subdelegation, like a precinct here in the United States. We interviewed a gang expert from each of those. I want to say there was about 70 of them or so. We looked at documents that ICE had, local El Sal police had, the National Police had. We did a detainee survey. We interviewed 300-400 of those folks. But to give you an idea of the scale in which DHS was interested in understanding these issues, you'll see that we interviewed close to about 90. We had about 90 interviews with experts. We ended up having boxes and boxes of interoffice memoranda on issues related to intelligence and other issues with DHS, looking at bulletins, annual reports. We spent a lot of time interviewing those who were being deported back to El Salvador. And the reason why we had to do it, it wasn't my choice. I didn't want to spend all my time in one of your detention facilities interviewing these people, but it took a lot of surveys and interviews to get to even a modest number of gang members that we wanted to get to in terms of individuals who were being deported, and we can go into some of that. And then we ended up doing a survey of gang members in the field down in El Salvador, which was sort of interesting. DHS funded this project, and sort of the interviews in El Salvador were the sort of focal point of this whole study. And then in the end, DHS said, no, you can't do it because it's too dangerous and we don't want you to go down there. So we ended up having to find other funding to get that aspect of the project, done. And then we ended up picking up a lot of data from ICE and the National Police. One is your Operation Community Shield data that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. We were looking at that database. We looked at intelligence data from the National Police in El Salvador, homicide data. We were looking at deportation data. What we were not expecting was all the prison information and how valuable some of that might be. And so as I go through this, what I'm really hoping that some of you will do is tell me where I'm wrong, to be real honest with you. I would really love it if people could tell me, no, you're looking in the wrong spot, you need to be looking in this spot, and you're wrong for this reason, or the other way around. Confirm that it's correct and that it's right, and we're moving in the right direction. But we really need this information to be vetted properly to make sure that we're sharing proper and appropriate information. Before I get started with that, does anybody have any questions about sort of what we were up to and why we were down there and what was going on? I really don't want to be the only one talking here, so please, there's nothing that is off limits here. Does anybody have any questions before we get started? Okay. So what we did was we wanted to start off with the scope of the problem. Was there really any problem, and does it really look different than any other gang? If you recall, there's something special, or there's something perceived to be special about MS-13 in El Salvador, right? And that uniqueness of it was thought to also take place in LA and in the Washington corridor. So we wanted to go through and look at just how similar are gangs in the United States with gangs in El Salvador. What's different? What's the same? Where can we sort of look for things that may provide us with some insight that we wouldn't have just from looking at others? And like I said, we interviewed a number of police experts in the field, and we conducted the first independent sort of census, if you will, on cliques in El Salvador. About 13,000 members in El Salvador, about 105. I have gangs up there. It would probably be more appropriate to have cliques up there, but for American audiences, it's typically easier to just stick with gangs. And we started to lay out exactly where they were in El Salvador. Some of it was through our own data, and then we would attempt to look at official data and see how right or wrong the intelligence was that the intelligence community had in El Salvador. And it was actually right on spot with what we were coming back with. It was a fairly well dispersed problem throughout the country, like the United States, right? We have gangs in almost 100% of large cities in the United States, well above 90%. And El Salvador was the same way. You had gangs dispersed throughout the country. But with that said, the vast majority of cliques and gang members were fairly concentrated in some of the most urban, poor communities that were there. And this is a map, a silly map that we produced, and you can see in San Salvador, the darkest spot there is where the concentrations of gangs were the highest. We did this in a number of steps, and it kept coming up to the same thing, that gangs were coming into the same neighborhoods, right? And they're coming out of the same neighborhoods, whether they're on the street, whether they're in prison. This exercise wasn't so important in identifying where the gang problem is per se, because most law enforcement knows where they're at. But what we needed was a way to identify those communities that we wanted to interview the gang members. And what we didn't want to do is find our way, for whatever reason, into an area that wasn't very well representative of the gang problem elsewhere. And so we were looking for a fairly typical, average municipality to engage in much of our research. And what we found was that in many respects, this is from the police perspective, many respects, MS-13 and 18th Street were very similar to street gangs in the United States. And these are the cliques in El Salvador. We found that the majority of the cliques were formed in the late 1990s. Now, that doesn't mean when gangs started there. That just means when the majority of cliques were established. We know that gangs in El Salvador go back to the 1980s, during and after the Civil War there. But things look fairly similar in terms of when the majority of cliques were established, how long the typical gang had been around for, or clique had been around for. It looks very similar to what you would find throughout the United States. We also found, this is similar to what you would get in much of your police gang intelligence data, right? That the majority of the gang members identified by law enforcement are somewhere between the ages of 16 and 25, right? That's really similar to the United States. Similar to the United States is we have about 90% of identified gang members by law enforcement are males. Very few of them are females, right? Looking very similar to what we would see here. we start to see a couple differences, according to the police, in terms of the crime that the gangs were involved in. Yes, they were involved in high levels of homicide, but what was more interesting was what we call instrumental forms of violence. In that it looks as though, at least initially what we were finding was that the cliques there were seriously involved in extortion. That was important because we needed to look at those same issues back in LA and DC and see as people are brought up here, move up here, whether or not those same phenomena are taking place or change. And what we found was, at least while we were down there, and it continues today, is there's a huge issue with extortion among transportation buses. Gang members go onto a bus, they take it over, they rob everybody on there, they get off, they leave, right? That might be one form of extortion. Another one might be the driver has to pay up. To give you an idea what happens if you don't pay up, you can Google this. Basically everybody has to get off the bus and they burn it, right? They just torch it, or they'll torch it with people on it. It's been in the news. It's fairly frequent phenomenon. Frequent meaning it's happened more than a handful of times. People take it very seriously because they know what can happen. It got to the point where the buses went on strike because they simply couldn't work out of neighborhoods and move people from one way or another. But what you see here is that the majority of the crime at the municipal level or the subdelegation level was gang involved. And it appeared as if that criminality was fairly organized, right? Almost more what you would see with organized crime, although in a much more rudimentary manner, much rougher, not as systematic necessarily, but nevertheless it was financially oriented, I guess is the point that I'm trying to make. Now, when we interviewed the gang members down in El Salvador, you see once again that actually very few of these are females, which we would have expected to see a little bit more of in street level interviews. Average age was about 30 years old. The reason why I put this slide at this point is what I think is interesting here is the amount of money that they were making compared to the average income or the income of an average Salvadorian resident or citizen. Right? They were making a little bit more than $400, about $100 through work and about $300 or so through illegal activity. They were making about 25% more than a person working in a factory, right? Whatever the average job is in El Salvador, they were making more than it, right? So it suggested that we do have there is some purpose in terms of involvement in the gang outside of some friendship networks and some other issues. Any questions? I really need somebody to ask a question.
I do have a question.
Yeah.
How did you come up with those stats? Because I was trying to come up with some stats for El Paso for like some of our gangs here. And since it changes so often, for example, they find a gang member and then they give it a blue card. So then that day they add them to the database. How did you calculate your stats?
Well, it depends on which ones you're talking about. With the police, we did a national survey where over a week we traveled to all of the precincts and did it within most of the precincts, either during 1 week or during another week. And we had a lot of assistance from the national police. But what we did was we surveyed typically the officer who was most involved in street intelligence or gang intelligence there to get the official data. With this information, this is from active gang members in the street. And what we did was we went to 2 cliques in a municipality called Santa Tecla. And we started with a meeting with a minister. For those of you that are familiar with El Salvador, there's 2 different things going on. One is you have a lot of folks from the United States that will come down there to do missionary work that's religious in nature, faith-based. And then you also have a heavy presence with the Catholic Church. And many of these non-for-profits are working out of some of the poorer communities. Once we identified some of the municipalities that we thought were more gang involved than others and would give us more of an interesting or more of a typical look at the issue, we started to talk to the minister. That minister introduced us to there were 2 cliques in the municipality. Introduced us to the 2 clique leaders, of which then we paid them, communicated with them, and then after that we used what we call a snowball sample and had people come in and we interviewed them, and we used the church as the sort of the safe spot to work in. And so these interviews were done over a series of trips to El Salvador, where we captured the majority of members in those 2 cliques.
But was this for like fiscal year 14 and 15, or for how many?
It would have been during our study period in about 2011. One of the things that we think that we know is most of this is fairly stable. So we could at least say for Santa Tecla, this is going to remain fairly stable unless something odd changes. Things can go up and down, but it's a little bit different than administrative data or intelligence data. With intelligence data, right, we can keep it for, I don't know how Texas is set up. In Arizona, it's 3 or 5 years, depending upon the criteria that a person meets to be documented as a gang member, depending on how purging works and some of these types of issues. But this particular information was from face-to-face interviews with the people involved in the gang. Yes?
So why are there more female recruiters out of the Salvadorian gangs?
Were there what? I'm sorry.
Why are there not more females recruited?
I would suspect, I don't know this, but I would suspect is due to the culture of the nation. I mean, even in the United States, what I'm assuming, like in here in El Paso, only about 10% of your documented gang members are females, right? Maybe a little higher, maybe a little lower, but it's somewhere in the 10% range is pretty typical. It might be 7%, might be 15%, but if you go outside of that, it's pretty abnormal. In El Salvador, these guys are involved in massive levels of violence. Of the close to 90 gang members that we interviewed, I think it was all but 2 of them self-reported committing a homicide in the past year, right? The females that were there were very embedded within the gang. You can tell that it was a different choice than having a family. It was a different choice than having a job. You know, you have a 1 and a 3 tattooed right down the middle of the face for a what's that?
What's their role within the organization?
The same as guys. I mean, it was their drive-by shootings, walk-by shootings. The women that we had contact with and that were in the gang were just as involved as, there was really no difference. Now, with females down there, in the United States, sometimes they'll be called a gang associate if they're a girlfriend of a guy in a gang and some of these types of issues. There's a pretty strong differentiation between either you're in the gang or you're out of the gang. And so females that were involved were going to be involved. And in the United States, people times often talk about leaving the gang and how leaving the gang, there's really only a couple of options of getting out of the gang. And we know that through the research, that's just not accurate. You can really just walk away from most gangs in the United States. In El Salvador, it's really not that case. And one of the reasons why we focused on this particular church as a safe spot is because this minister worked with some people, and if you truly, come to God according to MS 13, then you're permitted to leave the gang, but you better show that you're very faithful. You're at church every day. It's one of the stipulations, or I do believe one would be harmed. Of the 90 people, about 90 people we interviewed, within 6 months, I want to say 10 of them were dead. They were very heavily involved, yeah.
So, I don't know if you're going to get to this, but given the origin of these gang conflict in this out of Los Angeles, what number of these, or if any of them, were actually from Los Angeles, lived there, or Washington, D.C. area, or were these all individuals who were El Salvador?
Yeah, we're going to get to, almost none of these guys were deported. We will get to the deportation stuff, but it's the guys who were deported from the States and went back to El Salvador. It was very rough on them, very rough. And they argue they really had very few choices in how to move forward. And honestly, they were the easiest guys to talk to because I don't speak Spanish, right? I'm having students do this, or I'm speaking with the people who do speak English. These guys spoke English. They wanted to talk to me all day about it because they were almost in no man's land. They didn't fit anywhere. The people in MS and El Salvador didn't really fully embrace them or trust them because they thought that there could be something up with them. And at the same time, they had no means of getting back up to the States where they spent the majority of their life. So it was sort of interesting with that. So with regard to the 90 or so folks, 12 of them had been to the U.S. Most of those had been to the U.S. a long time ago. Right? There was only one who had been to the United States within the past year. The majority of those 12 came up as kids. Their parents brought them. They went back. It was not a major, it wasn't necessarily a life-changing event in terms of something that they recalled and happened just the other day. But my point with some of this is, if we were just to look at this information with active gang members, with the exception of the types of crime that they engaged in and the degree of violence that they engaged in, they actually look fairly similar to gang members in the United States. Who they live with, income is very different, obviously. Gang members in the United States aren't able to most gang members can't pick up that kind of cash through gang involvement in the United States. From what we know from prior research. But a lot of things are the same. I don't get into it here, but we do see that the gender is similar. Another one is how they get into the gang. If you were to take, some of you may have been here for Scott Decker's talk, if you were to look at his work in St. Louis, or you take a look at scholars' work in other cities where they're interviewing active gang members, in terms of the gang joining process, this wouldn't look all that different. About 75% of them get jumped in, others get fought in, very few of them get sexed in, right? In the US, you might have more that are born in, right, or just because they're from the neighborhood or whatnot. But it actually looks fairly similar. And I actually do have a point that I'm going to with this here in a bit, albeit I'm probably being a little professorial about taking the long way there. With turf, MS 13th and 18th Street were fairly similar. Now, according to the US, there was this major difference between, if you look at key stakeholders in the states or intelligence community, there's this massive difference between 18th Street and MS. MS is supposed to be much more structured than 18th Street, right? 18th Street, they argued, is much more traditional, looks like much more like an American gang. MS-13 is supposed to be this highly organized, sophisticated entity that can carry out a more sophisticated criminal enterprises. And what we found was, with regard to in El Salvador, when we interviewed them, granted there's a smaller number at the 18th Street, they were actually fairly similar with the exception of supporting a political issue. MS-13 was a little bit more deeply involved in politics there, connections with politics. One of the reasons why we had to cut out 18th Street was the situation. We had to stop with them because the situation became it was too at risk. There was too much risk involved in it in terms of the type of weaponry these guys were showing up with, some of the other illegal activity that was being engaged in. So we had to shut down that part of the project, and we were working with the outreach group at the time, not the minister that we finished up with on the project. But with regard to 18th Street, you could see that the police argued about 40% of the cliques were involved in what they would say would be more grassroots level politics. Get out the vote type stuff. The local politician might pay him a couple bucks to put out signs. That looks a lot like gangs in the 1930s and 40s in New York City, but not like gangs in the United States today, right? But the fact that they are involved in these subtle forms of politics is important for reasons of social connectivity that they have with those in government circles that may be a red flag. I don't think it's a significant issue at this point, but it does raise a red flag when you compare it to others. With the deportees, one of the interesting issues was when we were interviewing the deportees and we were talking to those that self-identified as a gang, the vast majority of those that were being deported had been members of a U.S. gang. Not even necessarily MS-13. It could have been anything in L.A. The deportees were all out of your Lancaster, ICE's. Who does your deportations out of Lancaster? I forget what that facility is called, but it's just north of LA, a bit, or in Orange County, I forget which. But most of them were folks who had lived in the United States for a period of time, grew up, became a member of the neighborhood gang in the United States, and had no affiliation at all with the clique with any clique in El Salvador. We did have about a third of them were involved in a gang, and they had some communication, at least, with the clique in El Salvador. So there were a small number of them. I'm not sure if this is... What we found here was a little bit higher rates of what we might call organizational sophistication, or the structure of the gang. In the U.S., these are a little high, even by the U.S. gang standards. If you look at data that DOJ has put out in the past and others, you would see that turf is usually a little bit lower. One person is a leader of the group. That's typically a little bit lower. And what it tells us is these individuals who were involved in a gang, who were originally from El Salvador, somehow moved towards gangs that were probably a little bit more structured than the typical American gang, for whatever reason. Cultural reasons, I'm not quite sure. But what you also see here is those that had a relationship with a clique in El Salvador were more organized. You have leadership, you have a little bit more rules. What I thought was interesting was that the gangs down in El Salvador reportedly made less money from gun sales, which makes a little bit of sense given American gun culture. But in many ways they're similar, albeit the gang that had ties with, or the gang in El Salvador, the cliques in El Salvador, were much more structured. We found, not much more, substantially more structured than those in the United States. And if I was Scott Decker, who studies a number of different facets of gang organization, he would argue, these are my words, not his, but gang structure is a lot like mayonnaise, and a little bit goes a long way, right? You don't need an enormous amount of structure. You don't need to have an organizational structure like the U.S. Army to be effective organizationally, right? The typical street gang is a loose confederation of individuals in the United States, right? The leadership in a hierarchy is very situational, right? Based on status oftentimes. It's fleeting, in and out. In El Salvador, we found that it was more structured, not like a business, but it was definitely more structured. And what we know from other research is just even a little bit more structure makes a big difference, right? And so, for instance, it was very clear to me with the gang members who were being interviewed in El Salvador that they had to go through a process of getting approval from the clique leader. And the clique leader needed to okay it. They needed to know what was going on. They wanted to know how much the interviewer was getting paid, right? The clique leader was paid for every interview that we picked up as a referral fee. There was definitely an issue of status there that was much more formal than what you would find in the United States, where leadership is typically much more situational. We also found that connectivity or cohesiveness among gang members in El Salvador compared to those that were being deported from the United States, we found that there was a much closer identity to the gang in El Salvador than in the United States. And I could go through, and there's fancy scales that we developed and the such, but the bottom line was that gangs in El Salvador proper are highly cohesive, fairly organizationally structured, but they look fairly similar to US gangs in terms of gender, age, how they join, a number of those issues. And as you talk to the folks in El Salvador that are in a gang, I don't want to say that it's like, oh, it's my family, and you go into some of these more stereotypes, it's a replacement for family. I wouldn't necessarily go that far, but what I would say is they are exceptionally tight group of people that are with one another and help each other out. One of the individuals that we were interviewing who had been shot had a colostomy bag for a Ziploc. His urine went from literally a straw into the Ziploc because he couldn't afford anything else. And the other members of the group realized he couldn't work. They let him surf the couch for literally, a year. Nobody expected him to live that long. But they also had boarding houses where everybody chipped in, and if somebody needed to live, you had a place to live if you needed food. But it was just sort of and this is a horrible analogy, but in some ways, it was much more typical of a fraternity house. The feel of people are living, they're living poorly, they're helping each other out, they have these common areas. There's a lot, those are the designated party houses, so to speak. But it was really a highly cohesive group of individuals, which makes it pretty distinct from the United States and gangs in the United States. And so one of the things that we did was we would interview these guys, and it's called social network analysis. You guys might call it, it's sort of a form of link analysis, if some of you have done some of that work. And what we did was we asked them who they're closest to, the 10 people that they're closest to, and we wanted to find out how embedded they were within the gang and what that meant. Now, this is just some examples here, but what we wanted to find out was, do they really spend more time? Do they not spend more time with certain groups of people? This is from the deportee sample and grouped all the gang members into one group. But one, as you can see, that would be fairly typical of gangs, is that those who were involved in a gang did spend more time with their friends who were in a gang, or that group. Fairly typical to the United States. We see that the mean age of those that they included in their sort of top 10 group of people that they hang out with the most, this could be their mom, their dad, or it could be friends. You can see it's slightly younger. You can see that, interestingly, the gang members were more likely to be integrated into social networks of people who were born in the United States than the non-gang members. We believe that had to do with the groups that they were in, and the gangs that they were in were largely comprised of U.S. citizens. It shouldn't be surprising that the folks that they hang out with the most, the gang members, were more likely to hang out with other gang members. But what was interesting that hit a tipping point for us was the fact that there was substantial difference in the portion of people that they knew. Those decimals are actually in the wrong place. It should be 3% and 39%. Of the gang members who were being deported knew a substantially more people who were in Mexico, who lived in Mexico, than the non-gang members. So when we were doing this work out of Lancaster, things started to click that maybe there is some form of whether it's informal or formal network between El Salvador, moving through Mexico, and the United States, right? Now, I'm going to back up a little bit. This took us off into about a 6-month diversion, and what we found is that the majority of that was due to other members of their gang who were in Mexico. It was a Hispanic gang, and they were living and they would migrate back and forth from Mexico and the United States. But they nevertheless had a higher, their social network or their friends did have more connections to Mexico, not necessarily for gang-related reasons, but for personal reasons. About 11% of the deportees that we interviewed were gang involved. This compares to about 17% of arrestees in the United States are gang involved typically, at least through some DOJ research that's been done in the past. Most of those, about 70%, like I said before, were in a US-based clique. About 30% or so, 25% were from a clique in El Salvador, or associated with a gang in El Salvador. When we asked them how they entered the United States, gang to non-gang, what we found was that there was no significant difference in methods of entry. I don't include all the reasons, I just sort of included the top ones there, but many of them entered illegally, without documents. That goes for gang as well as non-gang deportees. We asked them a series of questions about the types of organizations that they had contact with to get to the United States, right? You can see here that gang to non-gang had roughly the same amount of assistance or help, roughly 50% of those coming to the United States from El Salvador at some point used some assistance to get into the country. Could be a coyote at the border, or it could be something else coming through Mexico. It really just depended upon the individual, and we get into that in more depth in the report. What was interesting here is it didn't quite compute to something significant, but gang members did view that it was easier to get into the United States than non-gang members, for whatever reason. Probability of being caught, according to the gang deportees, was about 20% compared to about 25% of the non-gang members. And the cost of the trip was substantially higher. If you take a look here, for the non-gang deportees, it cost them about $6,000 to get up to the United States. For the gang deportees, it was about $6,500. And those who were living in El Salvador, when they gave it a shot, it was much higher. It was closer to $7,000 or $8,000. As we started to interview folks about the relationship between MS-13 going from El Salvador to the United States, it became very clear after about a day the benefit of being associated with the gang was not the ease and effectiveness of getting to the United States. As you can see here, for the guys who were living in El Salvador, granted it was a small number of people, it took about 44 days for them to get from El Salvador to the United States. The others, it was 2 to 3 weeks. But as we talked with them, the real benefit had to do with security. And for those of you that are familiar from the journey, you basically start off in El Salvador, you take a bus up, then you start to move your way, depending upon which direction you go, you get to Mexico, and then you hop on a train. That train takes you through Mexico. Typically, you're riding on the roof. But that step in Mexico was universally discussed by all as by far the most dangerous aspect of the trip. Due to robbery, rape, the violence is especially high. You have a number of Mexican gangs that will prey upon those traveling through Mexico. And the folks, the gang members that we communicated with, articulated that the real benefit of being in one of these Salvadoran gangs and getting to the United States was that you always found peers to make your way with that you had help from, that would watch your back. Right? I mean, some of the people, if you talk to some of the women deportees, many of them made the assumption they will be raped on the way up. That was a foregone conclusion. That was something that they prepared for, right? Whether it was with condoms, whether it was psychologically, or whether it was with the people that they would travel with, right? With the individuals who were involved with MS-13 or whatnot, with the gang in El Salvador, that ended up not being the major issue, and instead they could turn around and use it as a benefit for, let's take a few days, let's stop in this town, let's get off the train, let's try to make a few bucks. Most of the time it was make a few bucks illegally, but they had this peer group that they were able to network with and make that trip what they argued was safer, easier. And when they say easier, my interpretation of that was it was easier psychologically, right? Because they weren't on their own or with people that were going to be easier to be victimized. Now, with that said, at the same time, which took a while to draw out of them, the problems that they had would be victimization, though, by other gangs. And so you would have MS, who would be on the same train as somebody who is in 18th Street, and occasionally that would turn into a major issue that would lead to violence and a number of issues. And I'm sure some of you have seen the reports of violence that takes place along the train line up through Mexico and the United States. And I'm going to go through this real quick because I know that we're due a break. One of the things that we found was, and this is here, we've done some school-based surveys, but levels of violence and criminality is substantially different between gangs and gang members in El Salvador, more so than in the United States. Rates of violence, criminality. If we might have a 1 to 8 difference in criminality in the states, meaning for every for a gang member who commits 1 robbery, a non-gang member who commits a robbery, a gang member may commit 8, right? In El Salvador, we found that the disparity was much higher. There were stark differences between those who were in a gang and who were not in a gang. Different than the United States, where there is something different about that group organization that is altering the degree, severity, amount, whatever you want to say, in terms of the amount of criminality. A sort of side project, and this is sort of a good point of departure that's going to move us into the next part, is that by chance we started to look at the impact of deportation. And we started to look at what really is the impact of deporting Salvadoran immigrants back from the U.S. or from the U.S. back to El Salvador. Everybody was telling us that it was a major problem. I mean, in El Salvador, people were furious about deportees. They're a problem, they create issues, but we couldn't quite figure out and get a grasp of what was going on. So for fun, we just sort of were looking at the issue from a community perspective, and this ended up sending us off into a different direction that ended up being relevant, that I'll get to in the next section, is that in areas where individuals were being deported, there was a substantial increase in homicides. Substantial. Unarguably, when you think about and you compare one bad neighborhood to another bad neighborhood, if you compare poverty one neighborhood to another, levels of crime, whatever it might be, if you were to take like neighborhoods but then insert in more deportees in one neighborhood than another, homicides flourished. They took off. It was very clear that deporting these individuals down there was a problem in these neighborhoods. And then we started to look at, and we threw the issue of gangs in. And what we found was that effect completely disappeared when you have gangs in the neighborhood. So when individuals are deported from the United States to El Salvador, if there are gangs in that neighborhood, the deportees had no effect. And as we started to talk with people, some of these active gang members in particular, that's because they argue that's because they have control of the streets. And they're the ones who make decisions on who's going to stay, who's not going to stay, how people are going to behave, not going to behave. And from my perspective, whether it's working in one country or not, I felt very strongly that just can't be the case, right? But we have something going on here that suggests something about gang neighborhoods are different. And what we what we find is that as we started to wrap up these similarities and differences between Salvadoran-based gangs and U.S.-based gangs, right? We see, like everywhere, we have concentrations of gang problems, concentrations of violence, more likely to be male. You're young when you join, similar types of establishment or initiation. We even saw similarities in means and methods in which they entered the United States. But we saw some differences that were really relevant, I think, that got us moving in a different direction. One is that they were a little bit more structured than U.S. gangs. We saw a lot more cohesion, informal cohesion. We saw more folks who were embedded with friendship networks out of Mexico, a little bit more politically active. We saw a lot more instrumental crime, violence taking place for a very specific purpose to enhance the gang, not just for reputation, but to make money, to hold on to turf, to be able to sell dope, to be able to extort businesses. And what really tipped us off that I want to talk to next after the break about is gangs had a remarkable effect on stabilizing violence in communities when it came to deportees. I can't tell you the kind of effect that deportees had on non-gang neighborhoods. Substantial. They disrupted markets. As you talk to these folks, it made a massive difference in the life of the community when somebody was deported back there. Oftentimes, this person doesn't have any family back there, whatnot, and it creates these conflicts that normally wouldn't take place in the day-to-day running. In neighborhoods with gangs, that was not the case. Things were very stable, and when you talk to the gang members and the clique leaders, they argued that's because of us. And so where we're going to tip off sort of after the break, where we're going to move after the break, is really how much control do they have? And we'll talk a little bit about comparing the ability of the government to control the streets and the ability of the police to take care of what they need to take care of versus what the gangs can do, and then what is the logical conclusion from there and its implications for the United States as well as methods of immigration.